Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of the Race O'Clock podcast with me, your host, Daniel Gilligan. It's going to be an interesting one, this one, I think, because we're going to be looking ahead to testing, which is starting this week, of course. By the time this episode is out, half of the first day of testing will be done, or maybe even a bit more than half. But yes, we are recording sort of early Wednesday morning at the moment, and of course, testing kicks off at about, I think it's 8 a.m. UK time, but of course, over in Bahrain, that's going to be significantly later in the day. So, as usual, I'm going to set the clock, and we're going to have 1 hour to discuss all things Formula One, starting now. So, as we said in last week's episode, this one we're going to look at all the car launches and then sort of look a little bit ahead to testing itself. And so when it comes to car launches, first of all, well, let's go through them all. I'm not going to necessarily do these in the order they came out because, frankly, I've forgotten which order they came out in. But I remember all the cars, remember what we've seen, and I've even got some images up in front of me here as we talk to be able to go through these things. Now, of course, the big caveat that comes along in the first instance is these are launch cars. These are launch reveals. These are not necessarily representative of what we'll see at testing or potentially even the first race. There could be various different bits and pieces that get added in between either of those events, and so it could be something where we see a big change to how things are going up and down the grid in that sense. But there are certainly some things that we can see, certain big fundamental architectural things, and of course we can also see the liveries. So let's quickly go through the liveries in Constructors' Championship order of last season, shall we say. So starting with Red Bull, it's a Red Bull. It's the same look that they've been rocking since 2015, I think, maybe 2016. And so, you know, it's one of these Formula One designs which, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know, Ferrari don't make their car purple because, you know, oh, well, we've had it red for so many years, we might as well try something different. So Red Bull are going to do likewise. You know, it's like going back to the period of McLaren's dominance in the 80s and the 90s where they had the red and white Marlboro cars. Again, it was an iconic look, it was their look, it was down to their sponsors, it was down to other bits and pieces. Nothing changed during that time, so therefore the livery itself didn't change. So it's just a standard Red Bull livery. It looks good, but it's no different to what we've seen before. If anything, actually, it looks a little bit worse than in previous years because their new engine cover design means that we are seeing a smaller bull on the back of the Red Bull that sort of gets all integrated into the roll hoop. So maybe I could give it a couple of points off for that. But overall, you know, it's all right. Then we go to Mercedes. Mercedes then with this very, very striking new livery, a sort of two-tone, where we've got the silver at the front for the silver arrows, of course, their traditional racing colours. And then towards the back, you've got the black that has been adopted in more recent times, along with a few of these Mercedes stars and other bits and pieces. You've got the Ineos branding over the top as well. And overall, it looks pretty smart, actually. The car itself, the shapes of the car, help in that sense as well. And so it's a good livery. I would say that's a solid. Let's go with a 7 out of 10 on that one. I didn't give a score to the Red Bull. Let's just say a 6 out of 10. Would have been a 7 if not for the smaller bull. There you go. We then have Ferrari. Ferrari's got a very nice livery this year, actually. I'm going to give that a 9 straight away. That's a very, very nice looking car. I'm usually not a particularly huge fan of Ferrari, generally speaking. But, you know, that may change with the arrival of a certain driver next year. Who knows? When we take a look at their livery, though, it's all red, as you'd expect, but the way in which they've been able to incorporate then these bits of white and yellow is very, very pleasant. They've still got Ferrari across the rear wing, which looks fantastic. And then, of course, you've also got the way in which they've incorporated that use of bare carbon, which is sort of mostly restricted to the side pod gullies. The water slides, whatever you want to call them, down the back end there. So, yeah, I think it's a nice-looking car. Then we've got McLaren, of course, and McLaren have gone for something a bit different. I'd say it's a big improvement over their liveries of the last couple of years, where they've had the sort of the orange and the blue and the bare carbon. Now we've just got the papaya orange, and the Bear Carbon. So it's, I think it's a big improvement. I don't think it's maybe quite as striking as the Ferrari, because I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of the Bear Carbon, generally speaking, on these cars. So we can maybe put that as a 8, I would say. I like it certainly more than the Mercedes and the Red Bull. So if it's got to be better than that, but not as good as the Ferrari, well then naturally 8 is where it sits. After them, we've then got Aston Martin. Aston, I'd put in the same bracket as McLaren, really. I think there's maybe a little bit too much Bear Carbon, but apart from that, it's just a nice, lovely shade of green. They incorporate their sponsors quite well into it, and it's nice to look at. It's a pleasant-looking car, is the Aston Martin. After Aston, we then got Alpine. Oh, dear. Alpine are going to go bottom of the pile, I think, for me. That's a 2 out of 10 at best. The colours themselves are nice, and they've got a nice pattern that's going on and things like that, but it exists for all of about 12 centimetres worth of space on the bulkhead of the chassis, and then a little bit on the engine cover as well, and that's about all the colour you get, really. And then you've got the great big pink BWT sidepods. Essentially, they've lost any and all identity as to what an Alpine is. Alpine should be this like what we saw in 2021 when Renault rebranded as Alpine. And we were able to see them, get to this, this wonderful bright metallic blue all the way across. You had a bit of sort of that reminder that Enstone is a collaboration between the Enstone-based team and the Viry-Châtillon team, where you had then that blue, white and red to represent not just France, but also the UK and the Union Jack. So, going back to something like that, I think would be nicer, certainly on the eye, and it would just be better looking, frankly. Now it's just a Bear Carbon car. We're going to look at that coming down the start-finish straight, and we're not going to be able to tell whether that's a Haas or something else, and, we won't be able to tell until the last minute when it gets to you, basically. That, or if it's given a 5-second time penalty, you'll know it's Esteban Ocon. So Alpine, 2 out of 10. Terrible. Don't like it at all. After them... Now, who was it after them in the championship last year? I think it was Williams, wasn't it? So Williams then, we've seen just the livery, not the full car. Or you will have done at this point, but I haven't. And so, Williams then, very similar to last year, but a few evolutions, a few improvements here and there. I'm going to give it a 7, I think. And so it's perfectly adequate. They've got the lovely Duracell battery sponsorship integration over the top. They've got a nicer, deeper, darker shade of blue across the car. And they are, a car that has not stripped everything away in favour of Bear Carbon, which, again, come testing or the first race, we might see that change. But certainly, as of what they've revealed so far, at the time of recording, it's good. It's an improvement. After them, we've then got the horribly named Visa Cash App RB. I'm going to be referring to them as VCARB or as Toro Rosso or even AlphaTauri or maybe Minardi. Who knows? I'll be referring to them as something not the official full long name because it's ridiculous. But they then have, actually, in contrast to their ridiculous name, a lovely livery. Really, really good. I've seen some complaints online about the inclusion of the white and sort of how that's integrated. I think that it does maybe look a little bit out of place over the top of the front of the chassis, but elsewhere on the car I think it works. So on that basis, I'm going to put it in the same sort of camp as, say, the McLaren. I'm going to say it's and the Aston. It's nice, but it's not quite the top tier that Ferrari has struck so far. So 8 out of 10 for them. You've then got, after that, Stake Sauber Formula One team, I believe. Is it Stake Sauber after them? Hang on. We've gone Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Aston, Enstone, VCARB. I'm forgetting somebody. I'm certain I'm forgetting somebody. Whatever, we'll just go for Sauber at this point in time then. So Sauber, in their new guise, no longer Alfa Romeo, a lot of bare exposed carbon. I don't like that in particular. The bright green might work better in the sun, in natural light, but certainly all the studio shots that we've seen, it does just look like, I've seen this joke already done on the internet plenty of times, but it does look a bit like someone's just taken a highlighter and scribbled it over the F1 car. So I'm going to give that a 4 out of 10. On the basis that it might look better in the sun. But if it doesn't, then it's going to go right down to where Alpine is, 2 out of 10. After that, we've then got, Haas is at the back, so we're missing one. Which team have I completely blanked and forgotten here in Formula One? It's one of them, and I'm struggling to remember. So let's just talk about the Haas briefly. So we've got Haas then with their livery. I mean, I think it's worse than last year. I've seen people giving it a bit more love than last year's livery, but I wouldn't agree personally. It's not one that, again, it's just it's just bare carbon and just a couple of small swishes of colour. At least last year they had great big swathes of colour over the front of the car, and so from a front-on angle it looked like a white car was approaching you. Then it would turn into the corner and then the side-on view was black, and that was quite a nice thing to look at. But this year it's now just all black, all carbon, just bland. 3 out of 10. Looking up the list here, no, I haven't missed anybody. I just can't count, it seems. So yeah, we've got everybody covered there. So that's a good way of spending the first 10 minutes of the podcast and splitting the audience down the middle, because there'll be some people who disagree with those rankings and some people who agree with them, and some people who just not really care and be thinking, come on now, let's get on to a bit more car detail and information. So looking at the cars then, again, let's just go through in terms of Constructors' Championship order. So we've got Red Bull leading the way, and we already hinted to it. So they've got those sort of cannon or sausage, whatever you want to call them, cooling exits at the back of the engine cover. This year, they've also got this vertical inlet that's been spied at the Red Bull launch. There might even be 2 of them, potentially, down there at the entry of the side pod. That's to prep for what we are hearing from the Red Bull camp, a switch to Mercedes-style zero pods from last year. This at a time when everybody else is going for the Red Bull route of last year. The RB19, one of the most successful cars of all time in Formula One, and rather than evolve it, they've decided to do a revolution, really. So it's very interesting. It's an interesting car to look at. It also it gives me some degree of hope for one of the teams that has gone down a similar route to them for one aspect of the side pod design. Now, the side pods, of course, they're not the be-all, end-all in Formula One. A lot is made about them because they're a visually striking thing on these cars, but it's ultimately down to how the floor is worked by the shape of the side pods and how that then affects airflow further rearwards of the car, how it affects the initial impact of the air striking the side pods and then getting around them or under them or over them, and so on and so forth. So shape of the side pods is important, but I would say more importantly is the mechanical platform. And what do we mean by that? Well, it's in terms of the suspension in particular. Suspension in modern Formula One cars is very, very basic in terms of it's not very, very basic in and of itself. It's very complex. But in terms of all the dampers and rockers and springs and other bits and pieces that they're allowed to use, it's very basic. You compare it to previous years, they've had front to rear interconnected suspension systems, they've had hydraulic suspension systems. You go back to the early 1990s, they had active suspension solutions. This is all really, really back to baby basics, and that's been the case since 2022. And Red Bull has been leading the way in terms of that platform control, because ultimately, in a ground effect car like what we see in the modern day, and generally speaking, I mean, you go back to the active suspension days of the early 90s as well, the purpose of the suspension is to try and optimize the aero platform as much as humanly possible. It's not necessarily about giving good ride comfort or good quality of absorption over the bumps and things like that. It is more to do with just making sure that the aero platform is straight and level and gives you the most optimum performance. Because, of course, as you start to brake and let's say you're in a road car and you suddenly stamp on the brakes, then, of course, you get thrown forward in your seat slightly. Now, if you're wearing a seatbelt, being a good boy or girl, then, of course, or other, it's 2024, I should check my biases. But if you get, say, a big sudden jump on the brakes, then you're going to fly forwards in your seat. The same thing happens in a Formula One car, except to a much, much greater degree, because typically they'll be travelling faster than you in your road car, unless you're in Germany on the Autobahn, I suppose. And, of course, their braking performance is so much more performative than a road car. So they're being thrown forward a huge amount, but, of course, all of their moulded seats, the elements of the multiple point harness and how tightly that's done up and everything else, that keeps the driver secure. But the car itself is still pitching forwards, and so it's then all to do with this idea of pitch, roll, and yaw. So the same things in an airplane that then allow it to turn and move and so on, the same thing happens in cars. And so at the front end of a Formula One car, you're going to want as Red Bull demonstrated last year, what we call anti-dive on the suspension. Now that then is exactly as it sounds. It stops the front end from diving down and nose-diving into the ground as you jump onto the brakes. Now, when that happens, you are then controlling that aero platform. You're getting more consistent aero performance into the corner, and despite how good F1 brakes are now, with hundreds and hundreds of holes cut into the discs in order to vent heat out and be able to give great braking performance and so on, the aero actually performs a huge amount of the braking as well. It's why cars that are directly behind another have to brake earlier, because the dirty air coming off the car in front means that you then are unable to have the same optimal braking performance as if you're in clean air. So that's something which you need to take into account, is then this anti-dive on the front suspension. Now, anti-dive is accomplished essentially by where the suspension is mounted, and where you place the various different legs of the suspension then means there is a limitation in terms of the layout of that suspension, the geometry of it, where it physically can't go further than a certain distance, shall we say, or it's less likely to be affected by that sudden mass and weight transfer. So Red Bull leading the way on that one with pull rod front suspension. Now, pull rod is just that. There is a rod that goes from the wheel hub into the chassis bulkhead where all the suspension springs and dampers and everything else are mounted, and then when the car is under compression, it pulls on all those springs and dampers. Now, pull rod front suspension, Red Bull then have rear push rod suspension, which is something that they have pioneered during this rule set, both that front and rear setup, essentially, and it's something which other teams are now starting to catch up with. In the previous regulation cycle, it was the other way around. You would want a push rod at the front and a pull rod at the rear, because of just the way in which those cars were. But these days, you definitely want to have a push rod at the rear, because a push rod, the various different bits and pieces in terms of those suspension rockers and other bits and pieces like that, they are mounted higher up. So they are pushing when you're under compression, not pulling. So that's the thing to remember, essentially, is pull rod, you start up high and then mount to the car low down. Push rod, you start down low and you mount up high. Now that's especially important for these current cars, because you then have the ground effect tunnels that then need an awful lot of airflow coming through them. You need that expansion of the diffuser in order to give you then that car performance. So Red Bull have got that optimal setup platform for the mechanical control, for the suspension. They've got then this potential move to a zero-pod philosophy, so that could be maybe something that works, maybe it doesn't, but if they've got a good mechanical platform underneath them, which Mercedes didn't in the 2 years that they had the zero-pod suspension, zero-pod side pod, rather, then that's potentially going to actually be a success for Red Bull. I imagine that in the first few races before we get to Japan, where they have said is when they'll be debuting that particular change in side pod design, we'll still see Red Bull being very, very quick. So I've talked a whole 8 minutes there just on the Red Bull. We've got to rattle through these a bit more quickly here now. Mercedes, big revolution in terms of their concept. They've now gone to that more Red Bull, Aston, Alpine style concept that has been pioneered by particularly the latter of those three teams since 2022, but then it's been adopted by others in some way, shape or form since then. And for them, there are a few interesting, intricate little details across the car. Their front brake ducts, in particular, have a lovely shape to them in terms of trying to trim off that airflow going rearwards down the car, encourage a little bit of outwash. Outwash, again, is something that Mercedes have been chasing pretty hard when it comes to their car design for the last few years, with the exception of the zero pods, of course. There's not much outwash you could be doing with those. So their front wing, they've got that cutout slot in the end plate to encourage more outwash out there. They've got those separators that encourage outwash over the top. And then, of course, they've got this new front wing top element, which I suspect is going to be allowed. I think that follows the letter of the law, even if not necessarily the spirit of the law, which is really what all Formula One regulation is about. It's about finding the grey areas in the rules. And so that then, there's some inclination it could lead to them getting something akin to the Y250 Vortex, which, for those not familiar, on the previous generation of cars, you had a neutral section in the middle of the front wing, which was 250 millimeters from the point of center, hence the Y250 Vortex. And then, of course, the front wing elements would start from there. So all the sharp points from those front wing elements would then generate a tip vortex. That would then fly rearwards down the car, and that would then allow you to control tyre wake and other bits and pieces. Now, the Mercedes top wing element, where they have connected it to the nose cone, because that's what you have to do in the current set of regulations, there is no neutral centre section anymore. They connect it now via essentially a small cable, a small wire of carbon fibre that, again, satisfies the letter of the law as far as the regulations are concerned, even if it's not necessarily in line with the spirit of the rules. So it does connect it to the nose cone that way. It does obscure the element below it, or the rear trailing edge of the element below it, which is what it needs to do to comply with the rules. And then you have the main section of the wing is really only the outer half of that top element. Now, from where that is, they have got a little bit of a corner coming round, but they're limited by regulation as to how sharp that radius can be. So therefore, it's not going to be as strong a vortex as you would have seen in that previous generation of cars. So it will generate some aerodynamic benefit for them, not necessarily downforce. Front wings are not really downforce generators. I mean, they generate downforce by virtue of the fact of being an aero surface that's running through the air at high speed. But they're more to do with conditioning and shaping airflow for further down the car, in particular for controlling that front tyre wake. So I would expect to see Mercedes with a much more strong front end versus what they've had in previous years, but they, unlike Red Bull, they have switched to a pushrod rear suspension, but they're keeping a pushrod front suspension as well. So it's pushrod both front and rear for Mercedes, for Aston Martin, their customers as well. And so it's one of these things where that is maybe still a little bit of a question mark as to whether that's going to be a successful route for them or not, but we will wait and see. So that's a bit on Mercedes there. We got through that significantly quicker than we did with Red Bull. Ferrari are next. Ferrari, I'm worried about. I am a little bit worried for Ferrari because that car that they've shown at the launch, again, with the caveat that, of course, these cars can change and they can end up looking very different come testing and come the first race. It looks a bit basic. It looks a bit simple in terms of the shapes that are on display there. Things like the side pod entry duct looks pretty simple. It looks very similar to their one of last year, albeit with a slight lip underneath it now. So there's still the potential for a little bit of wastage out the side of the inlet there when it starts to get full up and you're starting to get a bit of stagnant airflow. The aim behind the Red Bull philosophy of last year, which a lot of teams have now copied, is that with that lip, it would encourage an awful lot of the air to go down and underneath into the undercut. And then, of course, with the sort of letterbox style shape of the inlets with a sort of a sharp, hard cut on the outside, it would then mean that a lot of the air would be encouraged when it falls out of the radiator inlet to go over the top of the side pod and therefore down to the rear end nice and cleanly. Ferrari's doesn't look quite as harsh in that sense, so they could end up losing a bit of that airflow out the sides instead of over the top. And then there's other details up and down the car which just, again, look a bit simple. As well as that, they have been adamant that the suspension is not as important as has been made out by the media, by Red Bull, by other teams that have gone down the Red Bull route. And so they have opted for the opposite of Red Bull. They've got pull rod on the rear and push rod on the front. So they're potentially compromising their diffuser exit by having that smaller potential for an expansion of airflow back there. And then they have got a limitation as far as their front end is concerned as well. Ferrari might be in for a bit of a shocker at the beginning of the season. I might be wrong. I might be completely wrong, because Ferrari have surprised us over the years many, many times. But certainly the last time we were looking at a Ferrari that was sort of all new, all different, and was a new design concept and was kind of going against the rest of the field in terms of some ideas, particularly with suspension, was about sort of 2016 sort of period of time, maybe 2015, 14. Now, 15, of course, was a good car in amongst those three, but the 14 and the 16 car, they were terrible, absolutely woeful machines. So, Ferrari, we got to watch testing, I think, to see whether we have a good or bad car on our hands there as far as they're concerned. We then go to McLaren. McLaren, I think, off the back of last year, in a good position to keep that momentum going forwards and get themselves into a good spot to maybe become Red Bull's big challenger this year. But from the initial launch spec, I'm not entirely certain we'll see that sort of a pace at the beginning of the year. It might be a bit like last year where we had to wait a few races till their mid-season upgrade and then they came good. It might be a similar thing, but they won't be starting as far back, I think. Now, the thing that I said about Red Bull earlier on that gives me some hope for McLaren is that the Red Bull winglet at the entry of the side pods is now mounted on the top. McLaren's is also mounted on the top, and they are the only other team to go that particular route. So I think that is a good sign. If the aerodynamic leader has gone for a decision, then your team independently has gone for the same decision, then I think that's a good thing. It's also an interesting way in which they've done it, because unlike Red Bull, where it's all attached to the bodywork and it's all integrated into the side pod shape, McLaren have actually done what Mercedes did last year and the year before, in which they have incorporated the side impact structure, the high side impact structure, as the winglet. So it is actually separate from the side pod. That potentially gives them a bit more flexibility and freedom to then change the shape of the side pod as the season goes on, and get better airflow solutions going. And it also means it will generate a tip vortex, like what we were talking about with the Mercedes in their front wing design. So that could potentially give them an extra bit of control over the rear tyre wake or the front tyre wake, potentially. Will mean the car is ever so slightly more draggy than if it had been a bit smoother and a bit more, integrated into that side pod shape. But I'm sure that the people at Woking will have been, with all of the emphasis last year on efficient aerodynamics, I'm sure they would have made their savings in terms of a drag penalty elsewhere in the car to be able to allow that particular design. So McLaren, they've got the pull rod at the front, push rod at the rear, like Red Bull. So I think from a mechanical platform perspective, especially given they've done an awful lot of work clearly in terms of the suspension layout to get anti-dive at the front, anti-squat at the rear. That's the other thing as well we didn't cover during the Red Bull bit, is anti-squat in terms of rear suspension. That's then when the car accelerates. Of course, it's the opposite to when you brake hard. You're not being thrown forward, you're being thrown back in your seat. And the car itself will throw itself backwards as well. So the rear end will start to squat down. Now, of course, the closer to the ground the rear end gets of these cars, the better, until a point, because then when you get to touching the ground, that's then when the diffuser will stall. You'll then have the porpoising starting to happen at that point. And for those who are not aware, porpoising is this aerodynamic effect where essentially you build up downforce and downforce and downforce at the rear end on these ground effect cars. They squat down, they touch the ground, they stall themselves out because then the airflow can't get through anymore, and then they jump up. But because they're no longer on the ground, they then squat down again because they're still going at high speed. And then they stall, so they bounce back up and bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce. So it's this oscillation of the car, essentially. Now, that is uncomfortable for the drivers. It results in mechanical problems as well, potentially, where the car is being shaken up and down. And then it also means that going into a braking zone, you've got a problem because then the car is not being consistent in its aero platform as you get onto the brakes. And as we mentioned before, it's not just the brakes, but the aero as well that massively impacts your braking performance. So McLaren, I think, could be in a good position, but we will have to wait and see. Aston Martin, then, to get to the fifth team. It looks like a strong evolution of their car last year. That came out the blocks, of course, very, very quick. They had a bit of a fumble mid-season in terms of development, and then towards the very back end of the season, maybe the last 3-4 races, something like that, they then started to come back towards the front of the field once more when they'd sort of figured out their correlation problems and other bits and pieces there too. So I think that Aston could be a potential contender. Honestly, at this stage, where I'm not so confident with Ferrari and with Mercedes being a brand new concept for them, so I don't know how they will shape out. At this point, I would say it's going to be a Red Bull, McLaren, Aston pecking order at the start of the season. I could be wrong, as I say, but that would be an assumption of mine at this early stage. The Aston looks like it's just more intricate, it's more extreme in certain areas, it's all evolution rather than revolution, so at least they'll have a sort of consistent base to work off of compared to what they had before. And of course their technical team, including Dan Fallows, the team principal Mike Crack. Got to make sure you have a pause in there, otherwise that becomes a bit awkward. That's then something where we should end up seeing them starting the season well. And if they do start ahead of Mercedes and they then are able to develop well and keep ahead of Mercedes, well, then a certain driver market opportunity for Fernando Alonso he may not wish to take. Of course, we will discuss that a little bit more later on. So we then have Alpine. Alpine, oh God, it looks ugly. If I'm honest with you, it looks ugly. I don't know where they're going to place, to be perfectly honest with you. Alpine is a real unknown for me. Their nose looks like an F2 car. Their various bits and pieces further rearwards look a bit bulky. as they have done the last couple of years, really. I mean, you look at things like their cooling solutions in 21 and 22, the car just looked big and bulky and awkward. That being said, in those years, they have produced cars with pretty good aero platforms, good aero efficiency as well, because, of course, they're hampered by the Renault engine, being a bit down on power versus all the others. So, Alpine, don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they occupied the same position they were in last year. A little bit of a no man's land in 6th place, where they're not quite with the top 5 and they are not quite as far down as the rest. So yeah, that's all I can really say as far as they're concerned. We've then got Williams. Williams, haven't seen the car yet. Again, by the time you listen to this, you will have seen it, but I haven't seen the Williams car, so no idea. If I was to hazard a guess, I would say they've probably gone for that, same solution as Mercedes and Aston in terms of pushrod front and rear suspension. And they are, they've been discussing how they want to be pursuing more load now, more downforce as opposed to that sort of straight line speed, low drag philosophy that they've been pioneering for quite some time now. So we'll have to wait and see, I think. It could be a year in which we see Williams go backwards, though, from where they were last year. And that's not necessarily from their design, but because of the next teams to come up. Because we've then got VCarb, and those guys then, they're taking an awful lot from Red Bull. A lot from Red Bull. And with how good last year's car was, even with all the between season development that happens, which, ends up resulting in cars getting much faster from one season to the next, I still think they will be pretty quick. In fact, actually, they might be the one up in 6th place. They might be fighting Alpine up there. They could potentially be even getting even higher up. If they do, then Zak Brown is going to blow his top, frankly, because that team, there's the co-ownership, not co-ownership, there's the shared ownership between Red Bull and VCarb. That's always been something of a grey area for Formula One, though in times gone by when they were not as well funded, when they were just a place for their junior drivers to go and so on, it was essentially given a bit of a pass. Nobody really was concerned with it. Now we're in an era of cost cap, and therefore you don't have to be as well funded as years gone by to be competitive, because the upper end of the cost cap limit is around whatever it is now, 130 million US. So compare that to years gone by where it was 350, 400 million being spent by the top teams. Yeah, of course. And AlphaTauri, or Toro Rosso as it would have been known back then, could not compete in the same category as those. But ultimately, now they can, and they're also getting all their bits from Red Bull. So it's I'm curious there, because they've also now got this switch to the pull rod front and push rod rear, like McLaren, like Red Bull, and like Stake Sauber, who's then who we go on to next. So Sauber then, they've got themselves an interesting platform. They've gone for that, as we say, pull rod front, push rod rear. From an aero perspective, I'm not entirely certain where they'll be, because aero has been something of a struggle for them in this rule set. They've not quite been able to get to grips with it. They've been very good in terms of material design. They've been very good in terms of getting the car down to and beneath the weight limit. They were the only team to have done that at the beginning of these regulations in 2022. So they are one to watch, certainly. And I think it maybe could be, actually, that both VCarb and Sauber could potentially end up leapfrogging Williams and then getting in a fight with Alpine. I wouldn't put it past those teams. I don't think either one of those teams are going to be up fighting for podiums or anything like that this year. But it's interesting to see now that Sauber are making those decisions to look more and more like the top teams of Formula One as they're getting ready to gear up to be Audi in 2026. So, interesting thing to look at. Not entirely certain as to where they will shape out. And then Haas, to round out the order, well, Haas, they're going to be at the back. Not much else we can really say on that one. They've got the Ferrari suspension, so they've got push rod front and pull rod rear, which of course is, as we say, not what we expect is going to be the optimal mechanical platform. And then, of course, beyond that, they've got very, very limited aero. Again, it's all contingent on what we've seen based on the launch specs, but it doesn't look that intricate and well-designed of a car compared to the others in the field. Of course, it's a Formula One car. It is very intricate. It is very highly designed. But again, relatively speaking, compared to the rest of the field, it's not looking that brilliant. So that's a rundown of the teams and their launch specs. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to end up going to questions. Q&A, where we've got our wonderful people on Twitter, on email, on Discord, and on Spotify itself in the Q&A section asking questions, which is fantastic. Tweets and emails. We've got some tweets then, first of all. This one comes from Jorrit Jan van Heffen, who's a beautiful man who has retweeted some things that we've been tweeting recently, so I love you very much, Jorrit. What is something to look out for during testing, and how can or can't it be compared to the upcoming race? So, things to look out for in testing are how confident the teams are. Look at the body language of all of the people working there, the drivers, the mechanics, the engineers. If they're looking upbeat, then they've got a good car, even if the lap times are not necessarily reflecting that, because lap times are, of course, irrelevant in testing, especially when you've got certain teams have not opted for the softest tyres available in this test, so therefore they're not going to be able to set as good a time as those that do have those tyres. So that's something you can certainly look out for, is for the lap times to mean nothing at all. Other than, of course, if someone is consistently off the pace, then maybe they do have a slow car. I'm not suggesting for a moment that if Haas set bad lap times all week, that they're suddenly going to be quick. That's not going to be the case at all. But yeah, it's one of these things where there are things that you can look at. I mean, in terms of the circuit that they're on, of course, this is the same circuit that's going to be at the first round of the season. So they're going to gather an enormous amount of data. So essentially, when it comes to that first round of the season, when it comes to Bahrain, that will be as optimized the cars will be all season long, because they will have done so much work in trying to get those cars prepped and ready for the season. But of course, they'll be looking at the Bahrain circuit in particular as well. That's why I suspect we've got teams like McLaren, and I think it's Alpine is the other one, that have not opted for any of the softer compounds. Yes, it is those two. Alpine and McLaren have not opted for either the C4 or the C5 compound, and that to me indicates they are just focusing on this coming weekend, essentially, and getting the systems all dialed in and getting the car evaluated, and then trying to get a good result out of the blocks. Because I believe, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, if I am wrong on this one, but I think it's going to be the C1, 2 and 3 that are going to be the race weekend tyres for Bahrain. Now, again, for those who are not familiar with Formula One, who are new to the podcast, new here, what we mean by all of those C1, C2, C3, etc., bits and pieces, is that they are the tyre compounds. So Pirelli manufactures 7 tyre compounds for Formula One. They are the sole tyre supplier. You cannot have another tyre supplier in Formula One. And when it comes to those 7 compounds, there are 5 dry compounds and 2 wet weather compounds, the intermediate and the full wet. And they are the 2 for the wet conditions. Full wet being when it is properly chucking it down. Intermediate when it is exactly that, when it's intermediate conditions, when you're somewhere between dry and full wet. And so they provide that gap, they bridge the gap essentially between the two. Very, very wide working range on the intermediates, so they tend to get used even when things are very, very wet, because they can still be quicker than a full wet tyre. Then you've got the 5 dry compounds, but they don't take 5 dry compounds, or 5 different type of compound at least, to the race weekends. They take only 3. And it depends on the circuit characteristics. It depends on things like the amount of load that is going through the cars. So if they're going through corners, a very, very high load, then they're going to want tyres that are robust enough to be able to stand up to that. And then it comes down to things like the actual surface. So things like the type of tarmac that's used, the bitumen that's in there, and other bits and pieces like that. That's all stuff which then factors into the decision. So for permanent circuits like Bahrain, like Silverstone, like others, you'll be looking at very, very hard compounds being used. So the C1, the C2 and the C3, because they are the ones which, they are very abrasive surfaces, because they're designed to be grippy and really grip into the tyres of the various different cars that will go racing around there over the course of the year. You look then to the other end of the spectrum, where we have then street circuits. Well, of course, those roads have to be nice and smooth, because if they were really abrasive and biting into tyres, well, they're a street when they're not being used as a circuit. So, you can't have them chewing up and eating people's road car tyres. So that's then where Formula One and Pirelli will be bringing the softest compounds, so the C3, the C4 and the C5. And those tyre compounds then will be the ones which they will use there, because then the softer, grippier rubber will then be able to bite in and not fall apart, essentially, in that type of surface. Sometimes they're not even soft enough on those types of surfaces, and you get a bit of sliding going on, but we'll wait and see for that. But yeah, as far as things to look for in terms of what we can take from testing and what we can't, and how that impacts the first race, yeah, first race of the year, the cars are going to be hugely optimized. I would not be surprised if we end up seeing what we call a Noah's Ark qualifying in Formula One, where all the cars just line up 2 by 2 relative to their pace to one another. Wouldn't be surprised by that at all. It's something which has happened before, probably will happen again in the future. It's a pretty good bet to suggest that, yeah, whatever the order of the cars is at this point in time will just bear out in qualifying. And then when we get to Saudi Arabia, that's when things will be a little bit more interesting, because then we'll start to see, of course, the teams starting to separate out in the pack. And you'll have one driver who really nails a setup, one who doesn't, and then you'll have a big discrepancy in terms of positions there between the pair of them when it comes to an inter-team or an intra-team battle, I should say. So there's that to consider. Anything else? In testing, you can look out for agricultural equipment, because the teams will be strapping great big aero rakes to the cars to try and then establish how the air is being treated by the car, and then therefore if their correlation is working. So between the wind tunnel, CFD, which again, for those not aware, CFD is essentially, a virtual wind tunnel. All of the work that they do in there in terms of designing the cars, then of course they manufacture those parts and then put them on the car. If all the design systems are saying one thing and then the real world says something different, got a problem. At that point, you've then got to try and then sort yourself out and try and figure out what's wrong, where the correlation is going wrong, and then fix it. Otherwise, you could potentially repeat the problem in next year's car. So if you ever see somebody say on the internet or on, as a journalist, whether that be in print or on broadcast or whatever it happens to be, that, such and such a team have abandoned this car for this year and are focusing on next year's car, the likelihood is they're not true. The one situation which that might be true is when you're going into a new set of regulations for the following year, where the cars look nothing alike and you're not going to be able to transfer anything. So say 21 into 22, for example. But yeah, generally speaking, if a team in a stable set of regulations, if they have a problem with a car, they will keep, if they're worth their salt at least, they will keep developing that car throughout the season in order to establish what has gone wrong and then make sure they don't repeat that problem in the following year's car. Because if it's something fundamental to the architecture of the car and you repeat it in next year's car, then no amount of development is going to then fix it in that year. So you'll then have another year written off as a result. So yeah, bit of a tangent there, but yes, good question there from Yorit. We've then got Ben on Twitter and Dan on Spotify, both asking essentially the same question: what are your predictions for the full season? Outside of what I've really discussed there with the car launches themselves and how the cars initially look in those launch specs, based on my relatively limited understanding of the mechanical and the aerodynamic sides of Formula One, I can't really say more than that, because again, we haven't seen the cars run in testing yet. We haven't been able to see whether the body language of the cars means that it's skittish and it's looking non-compliant, or whether it's a very compliant car that is doing exactly what the driver wants. It looks very balanced and very planted, where they've got good aero performance in the GPS data off of certain corners and things like that. So testing will bear out, and then next week's show I'll probably have a better idea as far as predictions for the season are concerned. That being said, though, predictions at the start of the season can be a dangerous thing to do, because of course we've got these things like Red Bull's announced that move to zero-pod style side pods in Japan. That could make or break their season, because of course it could go the other way. It could end up being something which it didn't work for Mercedes and it doesn't work for them. It's not as if Mercedes are incompetent as a team, far from it. There's a reason why they won 8 titles on the bounce and 7 titles, drivers' titles on the bounce. They're a good team. So it could be that the zero pod doesn't work for Red Bull. And if it does, then Red Bull suddenly could have a compromised year in which they need to build up as much of a margin as they can at the beginning and then pray that everybody else doesn't then overhaul them later on in the season when development kicks in and those cars get quicker. potentially. The other thing to say is that it's not necessarily a slam dunk. So this is something that I can say. It's not necessarily a prediction, because I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, least of all mine, but it's not necessarily a slam dunk that Red Bull will dominate this year just because they dominated last year. That has been the case in Formula One in previous years, of course, but it's not necessarily a guarantee. And the reason for that is because we're currently in an aero formula. We're in an engine freeze right now, so the engines, broadly speaking, are up to parity. Alpine with the Renault engine are ever so slightly behind in terms of power, but it's not going to be by very much. We're going to be talking, somewhere around 10 to 15 horsepower, maybe something like that. But in terms of that, we're in an aero formula, and we have seen in years gone by that, yes, whilst maybe a particular team has won the title from one year into the next, it's not necessarily been two dominant seasons back to back. And so I'll chuck out a couple of examples for you there. You've got 2011 into 2012. 2011, we have Red Bull and Sebastian Vettel absolutely walking it to the title. Red Bull took all but one pole position that year, the other one going to McLaren and Lewis Hamilton in Korea. And then when it came to the races, of course, they won the vast majority of them. Hamilton and Button managed to put up a decent fight in the McLaren and got the occasional race win, including, of course, that occasion in Canada when, let's be honest, Vettel fumbled the win that day. Button, for all the heroics that drive was, shouldn't really have won it. He should have gotten up to the back of Vettel on the final lap and then not being able to pass him because there was one dry line on the circuit, and so with his dry tyres he wouldn't have been able to get by him. But Vettel made the mistake and he went off. As it was, though, the title was wrapped up with races to go. So it was one of these things where that season we then go into 2012, and then all of a sudden we have a Red Bull on the back foot who didn't quite understand their car. There was a slight subtle regulation change between those 2 years, but ultimately it was all aero regs still. You had an engine freeze at that time as well. And so, we then end up seeing 7 different winners in the first 7 races for the first and only time in Formula One's history. So, and then we went down to the wire in terms of the championship fight in Brazil. And Alonso missed out by just 2 points, 3 points, maybe something like that. So it was incredibly, incredibly close throughout the whole year. And if not for, one flashpoint here or flashpoint there, we look at Spa, turn 1, when Grosjean went over the top of Alonso. You look at Alonso making a mistake in Japan at turn number 1. If not for either of those two incidents, then Fernando Alonso would have been world champion in 2012. So it's one of these things where, these things can change. There can be a potential for an upset for the car at the head of the field when it's an aero formula. When it's an engine formula, as it was early on in the hybrid era, so, we're talking 14 through to sort of maybe 17, 18, something like that, then, yeah, it's more difficult to overcome that advantage, albeit, engine is not the be-all, end-all. Williams, for example, were very good in 2014 when the other engines were not anywhere near the Mercedes power unit. But then, of course, as they started to creep closer, they weren't quite good enough to challenge the main Mercedes team, but they could then start to overhaul Williams because Williams aerodynamically weren't as good. And it's an often touted myth on the internet that, Mercedes was only good in the early years because of how good their engine was. Nonsense. They had very, very good aerodynamics as well. Displaced myths around the internet. We've then got a question on Twitter from Jack, who says, will Mercedes compete this year? Yes, they will compete because they are an entrant in the Formula One World Championship. Whether they'll be competitive, I don't know. But there we are. We've then got some questions over on Discord. We've got one from Rob saying, expectations regarding testing. Well, cars will go round in circles and they will have many rakes attached to them and they'll paint them with aero paint, Flovis paint. That's an expectation regarding testing. We've got several questions from Sam on Discord, who says, how locked in is Red Bull's advantage? We don't know yet. Do you expect Merck's new front wing to be protested or FIA intervention? From a rules standpoint, I would say no. I would say that by the letter of the law, it satisfies it, but it might still be protested because in this current era, in the new set of regulations we're in, the FIA can get involved and ban something just because it goes against the spirit of the regulations. So in times gone by, it was always that if it satisfied the letter of the law, then it would survive. And the other teams wouldn't be able to do anything about it. One example of that being things like the double diffuser for Braun and Toyota and Williams in 2009. But these current regs, they do allow for the FIA to be able to ban things on the basis that it's against the spirit of the regulation. So, might end up getting banned. Don't know. But ultimately, we will have to wait and see. We then have more questions from Sam here. Does F1 have a customer teams problem? We'll have to wait and see for the first race to see how competitive VCARB is. If they're competitive, then yes. If they're not, then, well, maybe not really. Because, of course, you could look at customer teams and see how Haas are doing, and, they're terrible in comparison to Ferrari. Aston, then, well, they get an awful lot of bits and pieces from Mercedes, and they beat Mercedes in the first half of last year, and then, of course, started to fall away in the second half. So, maybe. But then again, of course, they've got a fantastic new factory, the first smart factory in Formula One. They've got all their new recent technical hires. They've got Fernando Alonso driving the car. So there's an awful lot of reasons why they should be towards the front, irrespective of being a Mercedes customer of various different parts. I think personally that now that we're in a cost cap, there should be no A-B team relationships like that. Now that we're in a cost cap, everyone has the opportunity to be competitive, and everyone has the opportunity, therefore, to be a constructor. And call me an old traditionalist, but constructors in Formula One should be doing just that. They should be constructing their car. Everything that they are legally allowed to build, they should be building. So that's the gearbox internals, the casing, the suspension front and rear, the chassis and all the aero elements they have to design anyway at the moment. But that's my point, essentially, is that you shouldn't be able to buy parts in with the exception of the engines, because they are so complex, of course, and so integral to the cars. But apart from engines, I think you should be able to, you should have to construct everything else. And sure, there would be some teams that would lose out in competitiveness initially from that, but then they would get that knowledge, and then they would start to innovate, and then they might end up coming up with something that is new. And ultimately, it's actually cheaper to manufacture your own gearbox or suspension or whatever it happens to be and design it yourself than it is to buy one in. It's just that, of course, then you can divert a lot of resource to then other areas of design rather than having, dedicated suspension or gearbox or whatever designers. Andretti being rejected and Haas Alpine being a... I haven't got my bleep sound effects yet, so I won't say that. But well, there we go. Then that is on the nose there from Sam. Andretti being rejected, we'll save that for another podcast, I think, because there is it's still a developing situation. There could be a potential for Andretti to go to court over over Formula One management's decision not to let them in, and then of course we'll have to update all of the thinking in the story at that point. So we'll wait and see. It's an interesting one, though, and I can see the argument for both sides. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely certain which side of the fence I sit on just yet, but that gives you some idea. We then got a question from Wilco on Discord saying, what do you think of the RB design with it looking like last year's Merc? It's subtly confusing when they say the RB, meaning Red Bull, rather than the RB. But yes, has Adrian fixed it, they ask. So, again, we don't know. It's these are all questions which are fantastic questions, but they are a bit premature. They're a bit early because, again, we haven't seen any cars, in anger yet. We likely won't see cars in anger even in the first day or two of testing. It'll probably be day 3 when they've really started to bed them in and figure out what makes the cars tick, is when we'll then start to see the cars starting to put some more aggressive, angry laps in. So, yeah, don't know really. If anyone can fix it, you would say it would be Adrian Newey. So we'll wait and see. Is the best way of tackling that one. And then we've got another question here from Sam on Discord. Daniel, a short look back to the past. 30 years... I know where this is going, and I think I should do an impression of this particular gentleman who asked the original question that Sam has clearly adapted here. So, Daniel, a short view back to the past. 30 years ago, Max Mosley told us, "You're not having any more traction control." 30 years later, we have Max Verstappen winning everything under the sun. Question for you. Is Formula One too dominated by Red Bull? Does the new rule set need changing? Are the cars too heavy? Do the drivers need more of a challenge? What are your wishes for the 2026 regulations or your thoughts on the current technical program? Less ground effect, more or less cylinders in the engine? So there we go. That there, for those not aware and are just wondering, why on earth has he just done a German accent? And that is, I think, actually not a bad impression of a gentleman who asked the longest question in a Formula One press conference that there's ever been. Go and look it up on YouTube. If you just type in longest F1 question, I'm sure it will come up. And it was from 2014, I want to say, when it came to a question for Sebastian Vettel and Sebastian Vettel and Nico Rosberg, I believe it was. But yes, essentially boiling it down, removing the parody for a second, and sort of boiling it down. So essentially the question comes down to, is Red Bull dominating too much? Does that need to change? What do we want from the 2026 regs? I want Formula One to put their foot down a bit, or the FIA, I should say, to put their foot down. Come up with a new set of regs that just they go further than what the regulations that we're currently in do. Close off more loopholes, be more aggressive in policing things which are clearly in contravention of the objective of the rules, which is to get better racing, to have the cars be able to follow each other more closely. Still stick with ground effect. If anything, I'd say we need more ground effect. We need to go back to the 2022 floors, where the floor edges were lower and the diffuser throat was lower as well. Because, we have things like the oscillation metrics that the FIA introduced midway through 2022, where if the car was porpoising more than a certain rhythm, a certain hertz value essentially, then you would be penalised for that. Your car would be raised up, and of course the higher away from the ground you are, the less downforce you produce. So when it came to that, you then had this change going into last year where they not only had that metric in place, but they also trimmed up the floor edges and the diffuser throat in order to reduce the effectiveness of them. Now, in reducing the effectiveness of them, it then means you've got less of that clean downforce being produced, therefore more dirty air is going to be produced because you're going to find more overbody aerodynamic solutions being used to generate downforce on the car, which then results in more dirty air for the car behind. I think that they just need to have that oscillation metric in place. Say, you understand now how to control porpoising, so you're going to get some of the floor edge back, but the moment that you end up exceeding that metric in qualifying, for example, then you will have to raise the ride height of the car for the race. And in doing so, of course, that breaks parc fermé, so you'll also get a grid penalty, for example. That's what I would say should happen in the new rule set. I also think that, of course, there are things that we already know. We know that the cars are going to be aimed to be about 50 kilos lighter. We know that is an objective. We've heard rumour that the cars are going to get narrower. I hope that doesn't happen, because for reasons I will go into on another podcast, because I've only got about 2 and a bit minutes to go now on the timer, so there's not enough time to explain it, but wider cars do not necessarily mean it's more difficult to overtake. I know that the immediate counter-argument of that is, well, wider car means less space to get around them. Yes, but again, we'll get into the reasons why that's not really applicable in the case of Formula One. Or certainly why that's not the main reason why cars fail to overtake one another, certainly. Weight being down is a good thing. And of course, we know what the engines are going to be. The engines are going to be the same sort of V6 turbo power plants that we've got right now, albeit with a 50-50 split of internal combustion engine versus hybrid electric power, and that's then going to be interesting, shall we say, because they will be simpler engines than what we have right now, because they're getting rid of the MGUH, which is the motor generator unit heat. So that's essentially recovering energy from the exhaust gases going through the turbine and the exhaust. So that is going to reduce the regeneration capability, because now we'll just have the MGU-K, so essentially just recovering energy via braking, which is what it was for the KERS system in times gone by, and it's what the recuperation systems on board many modern electric vehicles are as well. So they're going to need to be able to regenerate a really quite large amount. And I think that the rule makers are underestimating what Formula One engine manufacturers and fuel suppliers are going to be able to do, because another key element is that you're going to have 100% sustainable fuels, and there'll be a an energy flow limit through the engine. So rather than a fuel flow limit of a certain number of kilos per hour, it's going to be an energy flow limit, so a certain number of kilojoules per hour. That is going to be very interesting to see, because I would imagine that we're going to end up getting some very energy-dense fuels being produced at some point during that rule cycle, which then means that the cars themselves will be even lighter because they won't have to run as much fuel in the tanks. So it's all going to be very interesting. But with that, that's the last of the questions that we've got at the time of recording, at least. And so we've got just 29 seconds to go in terms of the timer. So I'll just get the outro started now, really. And that way we can round things off nice and early. So what do you think of this podcast, this episode? Let me know. We are going to, of course, continue to kind of expand things. I love getting your questions in. We'll start to get a bit more silly with questions as well. Ask silly questions, get silly answers, that sort of a thing. Let's go and do that. And then, of course, we can get involved with things like, there goes the timer. We can then get involved with things like we can do some interviews, we can do some guest appearances, we can do some dial-ins, we can do other bits and pieces as well. I really want to be able to get a community formed here. We will get a Discord server up and running for the public in the not too distant future. Right now it's just between myself and some friends who are sort of helping me through the early stages of getting the podcast off the ground, and I thank them very, very much for that. And yeah, we've got many more things to come. Next week, we're going to have, of course, a big focus on testing, because it will all be done by then. So please join us for that one. If you've been watching this on YouTube, please like, please subscribe. I know it's a horrible thing to say, but if we don't say that, then it's not going to be prioritized in the algorithm. And then, of course, if you're listening on Spotify, please follow the podcast. Please give us a nice, good rating on there as well. 5 stars would be lovely, of course. If you want to give 1 star, then do it to another podcast and just leave us alone. But when it comes to that, then thank you very much for listening, everybody. I look forward to seeing you all soon and seeing your comments, your tweets, your emails, etc. Please comment and let us know how you thought the episode went. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I've been Daniel Gilligan. This has been Race Clock Podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night.